So that profit and loss is a necessary foundation for the operation of the market economy, for this remarkable economic progress that we've had over the past 250 years. That's not that long in the history of mankind. Right? So we're talking about something that's relatively recent and that's ongoing that we tend to take for granted. If we look at what's happened over the past year and a half or so, as a result of policies that have led to this economic downturn, in a number of cases we see economic policies that have been set up to undermine that fundamental role of profit and loss in the economy. I mean, there's so much going on in the public policy debate these days, and you know, people talk about, of course, the healthcare reform is big on people's radar. You look at the huge budget deficits that the Obama administration is forecasting. As long as they're making forecasts, people are concerned about that. But what I want to do is to step back a little bit and to look at what policies over the past year and a half have done to those fundamental incentives that sit at the foundation of American capitalism. And I want to emphasize, I'm not picking on the Obama administration. This isn't anything partisan, because a lot of these policies began under the Bush administration. And so I deliberately want to talk about the Bush-Obama policies, because this has been a bipartisan effort to undermine the fundamental incentives of our market economy. I want to talk about four areas. First of all, I want to talk about the role of the Federal Reserve. Second of all, I want to talk about TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Third of all, I want to talk about the Obama stimulus package and the budget that was passed last year. And fourth, I want to talk about the bailouts. So let's start with the Federal Reserve policy. I've been teaching economics for a long time, and I've taught about the Federal Reserve and what the Federal Reserve does. And one of the things that I've said is that the Federal Reserve was set up to be a bank for member banks. So if you're a member of the Federal Reserve System, through the discount window, you don't need to know what that is, but you might have heard of it. So through the discount window, banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System can borrow from the Federal Reserve. So one thing the Federal Reserve does, and indeed it was established to do, was to make loans to member banks. And over the years, what the Federal Reserve does has evolved, so that really now one of the most important things the Federal Reserve does is to control the size of the money supply through open market operations. And what open market operations is the buying and selling, well, I've always told my students, the buying and selling of federal government securities, which controls the size of the money supply. We don't need to get into too much about the effects of open market operations and so forth. The thing I want to emphasize here is that the Federal Reserve has always bought U.S. government securities to do this. And over the past year and a half, under Chairman Bernanke, Federal Reserve policy has changed pretty substantially. And again, I want to emphasize this is a bipartisan effort. These things began during the Bush administration. Then Bernanke was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve System by President Bush. Of course, one of the big things that we saw, I guess a year ago, last spring, was the Federal Reserve bailing out AIG. I mean, this is unprecedented, that AIG was on the verge of collapse, and the Federal Reserve put up $80 billion to bail out AIG. Now later, the Treasury used TARP money to take over AIG from the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve has never bailed out a private company like this. This is unprecedented that a company taking losses like this, about to go bankrupt, was rescued by the Federal Reserve. A new policy. A second thing that the Federal Reserve has started doing is making loans to financial institutions that are not member banks. They're not members of the Federal Reserve System. In fact, they're not even banks. The Federal Reserve began making loans to investment banks. It's also made loans to other financial institutions. This is something that's new and unprecedented in Federal Reserve history. So stuff I've been teaching for decades, I need to change that now because things have changed in the past year and a half as to the way that the Federal Reserve undertakes its operations. A third thing that the Federal Reserve has done is it's begun purchasing securities that are not issued by the federal government. So it owns a whole bunch of securities that it's bought from other financial firms, not even necessarily banks, that are not issued by the federal government. The Federal Reserve now has these securities on its balance sheet. And what are these securities? I'd like to give you a list, but the Federal Reserve says that's secret information, it's not telling. About a month ago or so, Bloomberg News has sued under the Freedom of Information Act, saying that they have a right to get the information about what assets the Federal Reserve has purchased and what assets it's holding. But as of now, the Federal Reserve isn't telling, and that's under dispute as to whether that ought to be public information. But again, this is unprecedented for the Federal Reserve to be buying financial assets from not only banks that aren't members of the Federal Reserve System, but institutions that aren't even banks, financial institutions that aren't even banks. So before about a year and a half ago, I think we could fairly say that the Federal Reserve, while it controlled the money supply and had a lot to do with regulating banking, was fairly neutral in the way that it operated in the economy, that pretty much all firms were treated the same way under pretty objective rules. Now, the Federal Reserve has decided it's going to step in, it's going to rescue some firms, it's going to buy assets, financial assets from other firms. So what it's doing essentially is engaging in industrial policy, much the way the Japanese government has been doing, well, for the past half century or so. If you go back to the 1980s, Japanese industrial policy was heralded as a great way for government to manage economic growth and to have a high growth economy. Because Japan had a phenomenally high growth rate, and people were saying the reason why is the Japanese government's getting actively involved in picking firms who are winners in the economy, helping out those firms, supporting the firms that are winners in the economy. People in the United States were saying we ought to emulate Japanese industrial policy, get our growth rate up. But since the early 1990s, the Japanese economy has stagnated. You don't hear too much anymore about the virtues of Japanese industrial policy. And yet, what the Federal Reserve is doing now is moving exactly in that direction. The Federal Reserve is becoming a manager of industrial policy in the United States. And I think that's a bit troubling because it's helping out some firms, it's choosing not to help other firms, it's picking winners and losers in the economy, and that's undermining the fundamental role of profit and loss in an economy. So some firms end up surviving. It's probably no coincidence that one of the former investment banks is still doing great as Goldman Sachs. I say no coincidence because former Secretary of the Treasury Paulson was a Goldman Sachs man. So Goldman Sachs is doing great. Other investment banks like Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch got acquired, and still others like Lehman Brothers failed. And why? It's because the Fed, also with assistance with the Treasury, was supporting some firms, not supporting other firms. I think that's a very dangerous precedent.